Coming up on the Razzball Fantasy Football podcast, we are exploring the hidden gems at wide receiver that could make or break your fantasy football playoffs. Today's episode is the wide receiver matchup preview starting right now on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. And speaking of hidden gems, we got Ben Wasley, by the way. You follow at Fantasy First Down. Drop that O on Twitter. What's going on, Ben?
What is happening? You know, I was here yesterday and everyone got confused. They're like, what is going on? You're a day early. And then I made my biggest claim that Thursday night football would be a dud. And gosh, was I wrong. I mean, it was kind of a dud. It was a bit ridiculous, but it was a lot of fun. So if that's what we've got to expect this week, then I'm looking forward to it.
Thursday night football, and we were talking about this before the show started, is the definition of why NFL doesn't really matter or translate to a fantasy football. Like that game for NFL purposes was an absolute disaster. But if you had Josh Palmer and you had to start him, it was absolute fantasy gold. If you even Gerald Everett had 5 catches, was okay in PPR formats for tight ends. Easton Stick, if you started him in Superflex, had like 20 plus fantasy points because he threw 3 touchdowns. So I get it. The Raiders defense, probably the number one on the week. Fantastic start. So if you started the Raiders defense, we tip the cap to you. That's the way to get your fantasy playoffs started. Today's show, by the way, if you're new to the program, what we do is a slot versus wide points per game allowed analysis on razzball.com. And then I drag Ben onto the podcast to kind of break down which offenses have the best slot matchups and out wide matchups, and how you can exploit that for fantasy football. So if you don't know where that tool is, go to football.razzball.com, click on the fantasy data tab, and check out our slot versus wide points per game allowed tool to see where fantasy points are being allowed by defenses. So it's great for DFS, and it's fantastic for redraft. So we're going to be breaking down the top 5, essentially, top 6 matchups this week out wide, some slot matchups that you need to know about, and then also some downgrades later in the show. Maybe me and Ben will be fading some stud guys, or maybe not. We'll talk through it. But let's start getting into our top out wide matchups heading into this week. So some of these names are big time, and some of these guys are going to be maybe even talking a little bit about DFS. So we always like to throw that in for you. These guys have some value, but really this is redraft time, folks. Like, it's fantasy playoffs. There's going to be some names on here where I don't want to say we're skeptical. They've had up and down seasons, but we might be putting them in our lineups this week. Let's start at the top. We have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. We have Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis against Dallas. Nico Collins, of course, has been ruled out. Well, he's questioned. I think he's been ruled out officially. He's still questionable, actually. Basically doubtful. Yeah. So, yeah, Noah Brown and Xavier Hutchinson, if you want to get real weird, against the Tennessee Titans. Puka Nacua, Demarcus Robinson, and or Cooper Kupp. I mean, Cooper Kupp might be becoming Cooper Kupp again. We're excited against Washington. Courtland, Sutton, Marvin, Mims, or maybe even Jerry Jeudy. We'll break that down against Detroit. And then the last one we're going to talk about is Jayden Reed and Romeo Doubs. Of course, if you know Jayden Reed, you're thinking, why is he's a slot guy. But with Christian Watson out, he played a little more out wide last week. So he could definitely take advantage of a Tampa Bay defense that's extremely banged up. Now let's start at the top. The team that's allowed the most fantasy points out wide over the last 6 weeks is the Philadelphia Eagles. And they get to face off against some big names. Guys have been helping teams for a decade, half a decade, get into the fantasy playoffs. So that's DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Some notable performances: Deebo Samuel, Jahan Dotson, Gabriel Davis, Stefon Diggs. All these guys really went off against this defense. So, Ben, what's your thoughts here? Is DK an auto start in your opinion? And is Tyler Lockett worth streaming as a wide receiver 3 this week?
Yeah, DK is the top 12 option for me this week. I feel like you need to start DK unless you happen to have a really good room of wide receivers. Where it gets really interesting is Tyler Lockett. And for me, I'd also add in Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think he's a viable option here. I know he's a bit more of a slot guy, but he does play enough out wide. Plus, the Eagles are really generous against the slot as well. Lockett, I think, is the most interesting one. He's had a pretty tough run of games lately, and he's averaging 7 targets and 55 yards, which is getting you double-digit PPR points most weeks. So that gives you a really good PPR floor. We also know in the last 5 seasons, he's gotten at least 8 touchdowns every season. He's only got 4 this season, so you'd expect a little bit of touchdown regression there. Maybe this is the week that he gets in the end zone as well. But the guy that really interests me is Smith-Njigba. Now, he's led the team in targets each of the last 2 weeks. He's up against the Eagles. For me, he's an upside streaming option. He's someone that you can use as kind of like a wide receiver 3 flex option this week.
When I'm looking at this scenario too, DK Metcalf is probably going to be my start of the week. The Philadelphia Eagles, first of all, Darius Slay, I know it's only Thursday. They play on Monday night. Slay has been out the last 2 days of practice dealing with an injury. So if he's limited at all, that just makes me feel like even more excited to start DK Metcalf. But forget about that for a minute. It's also how you beat the Eagles. We talk about this all season long, air yards versus yards after the catch. There's certain players that are more vertical ADOT guys, other guys who do all their damage, like yards after the catch, like you think Deebo Samuel in that scenario. Well, DK is an air yards guy. He's 10th in average depth of target this season, and the Eagles are 3rd in air yards allowed per game. That's just a recipe for success. So I'm not stressing about DK. I'm willing to put him in my DFS lineup this week. Tyler Lockett, on the other hand, has been kind of, unfortunately, Geno Smith's regression and also JSN being more prominent than whoever the hell the number 3 receiver was last year has kind of limited Tyler Lockett to kind of like a wide receiver 3, and that's really it. And I think this is one of those matchups where if you have him in your lineups and you're kind of going back and forth and you don't know who to start, this is the week you got to put Lockett in your lineup. Lockett is also an air yards guy. He's 45th in ADOT and only 80th in yards after the catch. So if he's going to get it done, it's going to be this week against this Philadelphia defense. And something that's a little notable here is the Eagles do play a lot of man, and these guys are both have been better against, Lockett specifically has been better against zone, but I'm not stressing about it. I just think that the Eagles need to win this game. They're going to come out and play well. And I think the Seahawks are good. So I think this is going to be a good game, fun game, 28-31 range for both teams. I like that a lot. Let's shift down to the next matchup that we're going to be talking about. And unfortunately for most people on the show today, a lot of studs are facing these teams. And that's Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Now, Stefon Diggs is locked into your lineups. Now, the question is for you, would you start him at his high price point? Now, Dallas all season long was really good. Then they lose Trayvon Diggs. They seem like, once again, they're very opportunistic defense, but they do allow a ton of production. So I think Stefon Diggs could have a get-right game. We've seen guys like A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf, the Commanders wide receivers play well against this secondary over the last 6 weeks or so. So my question for you is, number 1, Diggs, is he in your DFS lineup? And 2, Gabe Davis. Are you willing to take a shot on him this week as a wide receiver 3?
Yeah, I think Diggs is someone who's disappointed the last few weeks, but I expect him to get right. You have to start him this week in the fantasy playoffs. And Gabe Davis actually said is where it gets really interesting. Now, we have seen that Dallas is the kind of defense that you can attack through the air, and that's how Gabe Davis makes his money. He had 12 targets against the Eagles and the Bucks and 6 targets against the Broncos. But against the Bengals, Jets, and Chiefs, against the tougher defenses, he had nothing. And that's why we think of Gabe Davis as being someone we don't want to start. But when he gets a good matchup, he's very productive. He can get a lot of the ball. And I feel like this is that sort of matchup where he could really shine. For me, that makes him kind of a low-end flex option. He's my wide receiver 45, but there's a lot of situations where you would want to start him, especially if you come up against, the Raiders DST or any of the Thursday night footballs, but exploded. If you know that you're behind, Gabe Davis is someone that can have a massive game. If he gets a whole heap of targets, he's going to get you a whole heap of yardage, and that means he could get you 20 PPR points. Now, it could get you nothing. And that's always the risk with Gabe Davis. But if you're in a situation where you have to go a little bit boom bust, then I do like starting Davis this week.
That's the definition of boom bust, like that juice in your lineups. Now, with Gabe Davis, here's the key, right? You just brought this up, and the proof is in the numbers. If you look at his last 5 weeks, he's got 2 monster games, like 2 week-winning games and 3 duds, okay? The 2 monster games against Philadelphia and Tampa Bay. Both those teams are inside the top 10 range in fantasy points allowed out wide. And ironically, now they're facing the number 2 team. I know Stephon Gilmore. And by the way, this could be really key for Gabe Davis. Stephon Gilmore has been used to shadow top wide receiver 1s. He did it with DK, did it with A.J. Brown. That could be something you see with Stefon Diggs as well. Now, Diggs does travel enough into the slot for I'm not stressing about this matchup too much, but that should open up more opportunities for Gabe Davis as well. So I do like him as a wide receiver 3. And maybe if you're in a GPP tournament play this week, I really like Gabe Davis as well. All right, let's jump down to the next one. This one's a little convoluted, and I apologize, folks. Heading into this week, we had CJ Stroud slinging it. Probably 3 weeks ago, we had Tank Dell, Nico Collins. We're all excited. The Texans, they're going to face the Titans twice. This is going to be the best fantasy playoffs ever. Well, CJ Stroud is out. Nico Collins looks to be out. Tank Dell's done for the season. And what do we do now? Well, if Noah Brown and Xavier Hutchinson are the outside guys, listen, Davis Mills showed promise enough over the last few years that he's not a complete dud. So maybe Davis is better than he's fine. He should be able to move the football enough against the Titans, who will be missing two of their best guys up front as well. So that could be notable. But what's your thoughts here? Are you even considering Noah Brown, who, by the way, just 6 weeks ago was like one of the hottest waiver wire pickups, or are you completely out on the Texans for the fantasy playoffs in week 15?
Yeah, look, Noah Brown's one of those guys where he came back, we all went, oh, this is going to be great. He's coming back. He was on fire before he was out. He went across 2 games against the Bucs and Bengals. He had 325 yards and a touchdown. Absolutely ridiculous. He blew up, then he got injured. He comes back. He gets 7 targets, catches none of them, but it's against the Broncos and Jets. And the Broncos and Jets have 2 of the best secondaries in the league at the moment, which seems like a strange thing to say, but it's true. And the reality is that Brown struggled because of that. Now, Nico Collins seems to be able to make it work against bad opponents. Noah Brown can't. He blows up against weak opponents, and he goes poorly against strong opponents. The Titans are a weak opponent. The reality is that you can throw on the Titans. And while I'm not suggesting that we're going to get another 100-plus yard game out of Noah Brown, I feel like there's enough upside there that he's one of those Gabe Davis type guys where he's a little bit boom bust and it may be worth starting him. So for me, he's a wide receiver 40, which means he's kind of in that like low-end flex range. He's someone that you can throw in if you're in a bit of trouble. Maybe you had Nico Collins and he's injured. Maybe you've had someone else injured and you're in a little bit of trouble, or you just need someone to fill in for the week. I feel like Noah Brown can be that guy for you.
Okay. This is like, I cannot do it in redraft, unfortunately. I think at this point, but all right, I'm going to tell you a bunch of shit here. You're going to have to listen to it. It is what it is. These numbers are going to sound fantastic. Now, Davis Mills, something he was very good at his first 2 seasons was throwing deep. If you look at his adjusted completion percentage on PFF, he was actually highly rated in deep passing and passes over 20 yards. So I'm like, okay. So why is that important? Well, Noah Brown's, when he returned from his injury, his average depth of target was 20 yards. Okay, they are showing his ADOT is insane. He's the vertical deep threat. If you watch him in the games, he's always catching deep passes. He's being targeted deep. Well, that's why he was getting 0 catches, because everything was like 30 yards downfield. So Davis Mills is a solid deep ball throw. The Texans under Bobby Slowick have been aggressive throwing downfield all season long. Is there an opportunity? Yes, the Titans are 14th in air yards allowed this season. It seems more like, hey, if you want to do a contrarian DFS play, go for it. But if he catches a long one, I want you to go back to this moment and be like, you know what? That crazy ginger, he knew what he was talking about. But I do not recommend anybody doing that. But the numbers say that there's something here in DFS purposes. Or like if you're talking like 2 other guys, none of them have good matchups, bring it to the Sunday Live Start Sit Show. Maybe Noah Brown could be in your lineup in that scenario. All right, let's go down to the next one we're going to talk quickly about is Puka Nacua, Demarcus Robinson. I want to add in Cooper Kupp too. It's essentially the Rams passing offense. We know Stafford is probably every person's favorite QB streamer this week, going up against the Commanders, who have been a dumpster fire since they've traded all their defensive linemen, dealing with injuries up front. They've been getting crushed. So I guess my question for you, Ben, are you just trying to get anybody who's a Ram into your lineups this week? Or is it just Cooper Kupp, maybe Puka Nacua, and that's it?
Look, Cooper Kupp, start. Puka Nacua, start. Amazing fantasy analysis there. I think that's blatantly obvious. You've got to be starting both of those guys. The Commanders are such a nice matchup. You've got to take advantage of it. That's not to say they'll both go off, but there's such big upside there that you have to start them. Demarcus Robinson is really interesting, and he's very similar to that Noah Brown and Gabe Davis type, where we're talking about a guy who could go either way, which is why we're discussing these guys. The trick with Robinson is how much is he going to play? He was taking over from Tutu Atwell. The problem is we don't know exactly how much he's taken over. Tutu Atwell got a concussion last game very early on. That knocked him out early. We don't know how much Robinson actually would have played. The game before, he was playing around 60 to 70% of snaps. I feel like that's the way we were trending. So it's hard to trust that he's going to be an every down play this game. And for me, that's just not enough. I know it's a great matchup, but realistically, last game when everything went right, when he played most of the snaps. He's getting 4 targets. Now, he's very good with those 4 targets, but I don't see that happening again. I don't think Washington's good enough at shutting down the other guys to make Robinson productive. I feel like they're just going to keep going to Kupp and Nacua. It's not like they're going to be scheming up Demarcus Robinson to be getting looks. He's someone that you can use in DFS if you want to get cute. I wouldn't be using him in redraft, though. I just think it's a little bit too scary.
Yeah. That's the right answer. Now, I have to push back a little bit. He had 10 targets last week. However, he's
4 receptions, right?
Yeah, 3 catches for 46 yards and a touchdown against Baltimore, but he had 10 targets. So, it wasn't great. It was kind of rainy in Baltimore. He's the vertical deep threat, but here's the other thing. The huge caveat here is Tutu. If Tutu's out, he's going to be an every down player. He had played 86% of the snaps. And when you talk ADOT, air yards, the Commanders are second in the NFL on air yards allowed per game. This is how you beat that team. Vertical, vertical, vertical. The question, though, is every time we get to this moment, everybody's on the Rams. Everybody's on the Rams. Everybody's start of the week, streamer quarterback, Matthew Stafford. Everybody loves Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. The question is it going to be that big of a high-scoring game where you're going to support Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, also Demarcus Robinson and Kyren Williams and Matthew Stafford? It just seems like if the only way Demarcus Robinson's going to pan out is if one of those other guys doesn't. And I just don't know if I'd rather put my eggs in the basket with Puka and, of course, Cooper Kupp. That being said, this is another Sunday Live Start Sit Show question. And this is another DFS dart throw. Like, I don't mind. In DFS, if you're throwing $3 in a game, this is the perfect guy to plop into your lineup because he's probably, $33,000 on DK, 3,500, 3,700 on DK right now. This is the buy down option that can get you a win, especially last week after 10 targets. There's something there. This guy played with Patrick Mahomes. Now he's playing with Matthew Stafford. I don't mind him in DFS, but I am not going to get crazy. We got here being a little sane. Let's just keep it on and do the right thing and don't party Demarcus Robinson in redraft. All right. Let's go to the next matchup and talk a little bit about the number 5 is the Detroit Lions have given up the 5th most fantasy points out wide over the last 6 weeks, and they're facing off against Denver. We have Courtland, Sutton. Now, I do want to throw in a caveat. Marvin Mims, Jerry Jeudy, based on targets, are kind of neck and neck when it comes to out wide targets. Now, Jerry Jeudy is the primary slot guy. That's where he plays most of his snaps. Because of the volume difference, Jeudy is actually kind of close to Mims. So my question for you, Ben, is we love Sutton. I think Sutton is probably a DFS guy this week. He's probably one of the best starts of the week here. But my question for you is, outside of Sutton, are you willing to take a shot on any of these other Denver wide receivers in a Lions defense who's just sprung a leak over the last 6 weeks?
Let's talk about snaps. So obviously you've got to be out on the field to be getting targets. And the reality is that for both Jeudy and Mims, it's been ugly the last few weeks. Jerry Jeudy's kind of dropping down towards 50% snaps, which is nowhere near enough to be a productive fantasy option, which is what was happening to Marvin Mims 2 weeks ago. In week 11 and 12, Marvin Mims playing 50% of snaps. Last 2 weeks, he's down to a third of the snaps. He's really not even their 3rd wide receiver. He's their 4th wide receiver. Little Jordan Humphrey's in there a lot. Now, he's mostly in there for his run blocking, Humphrey. And they're also starting to bring Brandon Johnson back in. You remember early in the season, Brandon Johnson was getting a lot of looks. Just come off IR. He's taking a lot more snaps from both Mims and Jeudy as well. It really is a committee approach behind Courtland Sutton. I don't want to start Jerry Jeudy, and I don't even want to roster Marvin Mims unless it's a pretty deep dynasty league. I'm not even touching Marvin Mims. The reality is he's not even a part of this offense anymore. He gets 1 or 2 looks each game, and that's about it. So get rid of Mims. He's not worth thinking about. Courtland Sutton is where it gets really interesting. He's scored in 10 of his last 13 games. He's got a pretty low floor, though. If he doesn't score, he's only had 12 receptions across the last 4 games. That's not a lot. That's not a lot to work with. So he is a lot more boom bust than we realize. He keeps on booming because he keeps scoring every single game. It's not like he scored 10 across 13 games and they were bunched together. He scores 1 every week. And it makes it look like he's going really well. But in reality, he scored in 10 different games and he's made each of those games look fantasy viable. The reality is each week he doesn't score. He's a bit of a dud. So you've got to be a little bit nervous about Courtland Sutton, and you've got to just not even think about the rest of this passing offense. Realistically, Sutton, very low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. The rest, don't even think about it.
You know, So when you're looking at the matchup in Detroit, which is nice because the Lions kind of had that weird game against the Bears, and Goff was road Goff in the winter December timeframe. I appreciate Jared Goff performing how we expect him to perform. You know what? I like that about Jared Goff. Okay, so now you're back in the dome. Yeah, exactly. Good or bad, you're reliable and you make us look smart. And I appreciate that, Jared Goff. But here's the reality. Now going into the dome game, I know the Denver Broncos have been a tough matchup for the passing games, but I expect them to get it done, whether it's on the ground or through the air. I think they're going to have a huge bounce back at home. And the best part, too, is Jared Goff will probably not have to do much. It'll be the ground game. David Montgomery and Gibbs, everybody's all over that one, too, against this Denver run defense. But the other thing on the flip side is that I do think the Denver Broncos are going to have to put up points. And I think Sutton, here's the thing with Sutton. If you watched him all year, the best way I could describe Sutton and Judy is, you ever see those goofy memes where it's like SpongeBob SquarePants? You know who SpongeBob SquarePants is? Where SpongeBob is like the really fancy SpongeBob, and then he's like the goofy SpongeBob, like kind of a dork SpongeBob. You know what I'm talking about? Those memes? Well, when he throws to Sutton, he is a majestic, beautiful thrower. He throws to Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy has no one around him, and the ball is 40 feet away from him. It's not even like Jeudy half the time. You're like, what is going on? Like, Jerry Jeudy knows something about Russell Wilson, and he doesn't like him because half the time it's just not even close. Now, granted, Sutton's making crazy plays, but it just seems like it might be time. It might be Judy's time. I call this I will not put him in my lineups. I'm not saying that, but I'm throwing him in my DFS lineup this week, and here's why. If you look at the guys who've played really well, Sutton's been great. He's locked in. I like him for redraft. But for Jerry Jeudy, here's the thing. Adam Thielen, Keenan Allen, Jayden Reed, these kind of like hybrid, kind of getting main targets, but play a lot in the slot guys have played very well against this defense. The other thing, Lions, 5th in air yards. Now, you don't think of Jeudy as an air yards guy, but he's 24th in ADOT, but he's 47th in yards after the catch per reception. He's getting those ADOT throws. I just think that the Lions are going to do their, and Jerry Jeudy's going to finally break through. I'm calling my shot this week. This is my hidden gem, baby. I'm calling Jerry Jeudy's shot this week. I'm putting him in my DFS lineups, and that's why we are going to cancel the show next week when he goes 1 for 10. All right, let's go to the next one, folks. I just wanted to bring this up. We typically do the top 5, but I wanted to add the 6th one because this one's also juicy. Christian Watson's doubtful. We have the Packers going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Bucs are completely decimated with injuries. Charlton Davis is going to be out for this game. Jamel Dean's dealing with injuries. They've been kind of rotating guys in the secondary all year, and now they get the Packers offense with Jordan Love, who's playing a lot better. I know he had a rough game against the Giants, but who doesn't? I mean, the Giants defense, let's go. Tommy DeVito would scare any quarterback. You know what I mean? Jordan Love he could go up against Patrick Mahomes easy, but Tommy DeVito? Nah, you can't do that. So the Tampa Bay Bucs have allowed the 6th most fantasy points out wide. So my question for you is, listen, Romeo Doubs is interesting, but Jayden Reed is starting to become that alpha one with Christian Watson out, and he actually played more on the outside. So what's your thoughts here this week? Are you starting any Packers wide receivers against the Tampa Bay Bucs?
The thing that's really interesting about Jayden Reed is he's got a massive target share, but he's still only playing about 70% snaps. He's not out on the field a lot of the time, but when he's there, they're probably passing the ball and he's going to be the number one target. So he's one of those rare guys where even when the snap count's low, you can still kind of rely on them to be involved. Similar idea with Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill actually plays a really low snap share, but whenever they get him out there, they get him the ball. So Jayden Reed's someone that you can feel pretty solid about. He's a wide receiver 3 option for me this week. It's the other 2 that really scare me. Romeo Doubs is the first one. He's a very low-end wide receiver 3, maybe wide receiver 4 type. He hasn't had more than 5 receptions since week 4, and he's only tops 37 yards twice since week 4. So that's 10 weeks where he's not getting many yards, he's not getting many receptions. That gives him a really low PPR floor. Now, he's scoring quite a few touchdowns because Green Bay's scoring a lot of touchdowns through the air. You've got to feel that with Aaron Jones potentially back, that may drop off a little bit as well. And you've got to wonder whether they're really going to need to throw for a lot of touchdowns against Tampa Bay. I'm really scared by Romeo Doubs. He's someone that I'm avoiding if I can help it. If there's any way I can avoid Romeo Doubs, I'm doing it. I am, on the other hand, oddly interested in Dontavian Wicks. He's someone that's been really productive when he hasn't been getting many snaps. He keeps subbing in for Doubs and Watson. He plays like 30%, 40% snaps each game, just subbing in and out. And last week, he finally got a chance to be the starter and he got knocked up a little bit. And for that reason, he didn't get his full snap count. But when he's on the field, he tends to get the ball. He's someone that can make it happen, even on a low snap count. And I expect him to play most downs next week. So that makes him someone you can throw in DFS. And if you're really desperate in redraft, he is a viable option. He's a low-end, wide receiver 5 type for me. But if you don't have anyone else, if you're battling with injuries, you just need someone off waivers, you could do a lot worse than Dontavian Wicks.
Wow. All right. Look at us digging up these hidden gems, baby. I like it a lot. I will not go there. I like how I picked my random deep dart throw as Demarcus Robinson. You got Wick. This is good. I think I'm personally going to go Jayden Reed. I think he's actually, because of the Charlton Davis injury, Jamel Dean playing at a limited capacity, and the Bucs secondary has just been so bad all year. Here's the other aspect of this too. Jayden Reed is a yak guy. So when we talk about air yards versus yards after the catch, Jayden Reed's only 74th out of 100 qualified receivers in average depth of target, but he's 34th in yards after the catch per reception. And the great news is the Bucs, you can do it whatever way you want against the Bucs. 4th in air yards allowed, 3rd in yards after the catch allowed. I think that's just Jayden Reed. Without Christian Watson too, it just seems like Reed. Last week, Reed was the second wide receiver. He got the second most routes, and he actually almost played 50% of his snaps out wide and in the slot because of that. So I actually like him a lot this week. I have him locked in as a wide receiver too. All right, before we jump down to some slot matchup, I want to shout out some of the people that joined the podcast today. We got Pat. What's going on, man? Jumps on the podcast from Twitter. We appreciate you jumping on, man. It's always good to have you on board. We also have Jamie, first time, second time, third time, 14th millionth time. Jamie's always a pleasure to have you on. Go follow him and his gang at Going for Two. Go check them out. Great channel as well. Josh jumped on. We appreciate you, Josh, jumping on from Twitter. Patricio, how you doing, buddy? He's between DK Metcalf and Puka Nacua because he's starting Pittman. Now, Pittman's a player we're going to talk about in a minute because Pittman has a matchup downgrade this week, Ben. Before we get into that matchup downgrade, let's answer this question for Patricio. Start 2 of these 3. We've got DK Metcalf, Puka Nacua, and Michael Pittman.
I'm actually sitting Pittman, which is a little bit crazy, but I'm very scared about the matchup, and we are going to talk about it later on, but the matchup is the issue here. Pittman's got such a safe PPR floor, and yet there's so much more upside with Metcalf and Puka. So I guess you need to ask yourself, what are you looking for? Are you looking for safety? Are you looking for a nice PPR base, in which case Pittman's good, Metcalf's pretty good, or you're looking for upside? Because I feel like Puka's less safe, but he has a lot more upside.
Yeah. Patricio, I'm pretty sure this is half PPR. I'm not 100% sure. You want to check that. If it's full PPR, I think Metcalf's locked in for me, and I think I'm going to go with Puka. I just think that Commanders match, I think the Commanders game could be a shit ton of fun. Like, the Steelers are going to try to get you into the mud. They want to have a slow game. They're starting Mitch Trubisky. They don't want to get into a high-scoring affair. I could see them saying, all right, you're going to be 21-17, 17-13 type game. While the Commanders-Rams could just be a shootout, and I want a piece of that. So I'm taking the upside of Puka with Metcalf there as well. All right, we got Chandler jumping in. Chandler, what's going on, buddy? ETN or Jerick McKinnon full PPR? Are you taking the leap? No Isaiah Pacheco this week. Ben, what's your thoughts here? Are you going to go with McKinnon over ETN?
Yeah, a lot of people talking about Jerick McKinnon. He's not the starter. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the starter. They only use McKinnon in passing situations. Now, it happened that when he scored a touchdown on the weekend, it just happened to be a 2-minute drill or the third down of a drive or something along those lines where he just happened to be out there. The reality is that Clyde's the starter. You don't want to touch Jerick McKinnon. He's like Samaje Perine. He's going to have a good week if the team just happens to end up doing 2-minute drills. But the reality is that's only going to happen very occasionally. For the most part, he's only going to be out there on third downs. He's not worth using. Travis Etienne's running back 1 this week. He's someone that you absolutely must start. Jerick McKinnon, even in PPR, he's barely an RB3. I'm not touching McKinnon at all. Don't even think about him. Probably shouldn't even be rostering him realistically. After
last week, Etienne had like 15 carries for 34 yards, but he had 4 catches and a touchdown. And so you can't sit him. Like the matchup last week wasn't good and he was fine. Baltimore's run defense is really good. I'm not saying it's not, but I can't do it. I'm sorry. I know. I get it, Chandler. I appreciate you jumping on, and I appreciate asking these questions. Gets the mind thinking a little bit, but at the same time, I can't steer you that direction. McKinnon's like the guy, pull the emergency lever guy. Like I've been streaming running back 2 all year. I just lost X, Y, and Z. Okay, you can plug in McKinnon, but I'm not going to start him over a guy I've been riding as an RB1 all season long. All right. Jamie, my chick needs some help. Oh, all right. Jamie called Jamie. Whoa, man! Like he's got all the ladies. He's like one of my ladies needs help here. I like that, Jamie. Good stuff. I don't want her to be mad at me. I like that. Smart. Put the blame on somebody else. So if I'm wrong, I need your help. I like that, Jamie. Pass it along to us. I need to start doing that more. I'm going to start reaching out to Ben when I have a discussion, non-football related too. Everything. Ben, you're going to take all the heat from me from now on. All right. Needs to start 2 flex full PPR. 4 points per passing touchdown. Okay, that's nice little detail. It looks like it's a super flex question because we have Bailey Zappi included. We have Zeke, Amari Cooper, Deontay, and Zappi. What's your thoughts here, Ben? Super flex start 2.
Firstly, happy wife, happy life. Good decision. Secondly, whenever there's a super flex question, I always include the quarterback. Quarterbacks have such high upside. We saw just on Thursday Night Football that when you have someone like Easton Stick or Aiden O'Connell, you've got a massive ceilings. All they need is to get a few passing touchdowns, and all of a sudden they already have more than most of the receivers and running backs. So for me, I'm starting Bailey Zappi. I wouldn't touch Deontay Johnson this week, not with a 10-foot pole or whatever you guys say over there. I'd probably start Zeke. I feel like Zeke's getting such heavy workload at the moment. They didn't get anyone else involved at all. I think Ty Montgomery saw 2 snaps. Realistically, it's the Zeke show over there in New England. They're going to have to run a lot. So I'd go with Zappi and Zeke. I know it's a little bit tricky starting 2 Patriots, but realistically, when the Patriots have the ball, they're the only 2 guys that are going to be heavily involved anyway. So Zappi and Zeke for me, and Amari Cooper would be the next guy up, but I wouldn't go with Amari Cooper, and we're going to talk about him later, and we're going to talk about why.
Yeah, that's the same for me. As a Ramondre Stevenson owner, nothing makes my heart warm more than watching Zeke being used as a bell cow. I'm like, oh my God. Oh, so you can do it. That's so nice that he's getting all the work. Isn't that so great, Bill? Thank you so much for that, because Ramondre's just chilling in my IR spot. Just thank you for keeping him healthy. Oh, thank you for sharing the workload with Zeke all year, because he's hurt now anyway. Great. Awesome. But yes, it's Zeke. It's Zappi. It's super flex. You start your quarterback. Even bad quarterbacks get you like 10 points. And that's going to be tougher for guys like Amari Cooper and Deontay in tougher matchups. All right. Jamie letting us know, of course, SpongeBob is hosting the Super Bowl on Nickelodeon this year. Shout out to SpongeBob. Big fan of the show. We love you, SpongeBob. All right. Ed comes in. He's got a couple comments here. He acknowledges that he's first in the chat. You weren't, Ed, unfortunately. I can't give you that credit. But, Ed, we appreciate you jumping on. And honestly, Ed, listen, keep up the good work. You were top 5 at least. You weren't 1, but you're top 5 in the chat. You're going to be 1 someday. We love you for that. We got Pittman as a safe pick, but he also says, who's a safe QB start this week? I mean, if this is like a general streamer question, like a high floor guy, what's your thoughts here, Ben? Is there somebody that stands out to you as kind of a safe QB streamer? Let's use streamer as the preface here.
Yeah, there definitely is. Matthew Stafford. You start Matthew Stafford this week. He's my top QB streamer in my streamers and stashes article, which I'll talk about a bit later on. Got to start Matthew Stafford. He's the main guy that you can use. Someone else like Sam Howell as well is pretty safe. We know that's likely to be a shootout. So either of those guys are a good option for you, Ed. Hope you're doing well.
Honestly, I was talking to somebody about Howell versus Mahomes. Mahomes on the road in New England, and I'm like, honestly, I thought my initial response was that Mahomes is so safe. If you look at the consistency numbers, there is nobody with a higher floor this season than Sam Howell. He has had the most 20-point games for quarterbacks this season. Talk about safe. I also Stafford. Everybody loves Stafford. I mean, against Washington, I agree. So I'm going to have to just tip it over to Ben on this one as well. All right. There we go. If Amari Cooper and Deontay find the end zone this week, we're going to get some angry letters as well. All right, Ben, let's kick it back down to the slot here and get into some of the top slot matchups this week.
Yeah. Look, we already talked about Cooper Kupp. Normally, we have a lot more slot matchups, but realistically, not every team relies on a slot receiver that's fantasy relevant. So we're mixing it up a little bit this week. We are going to talk about Demario Douglas against the Chiefs, but we're going to throw in a couple of tight ends. Realistically, we know these guys are actually slot receivers. They're just called tight ends. So Isaiah Likely and Evan Engram running a lot of routes from the slot. The majority of their time, they're running routes. They are essentially working as the wide receiver 3 for their teams. So we're going to chat it up and talk about these guys' matchups as well. Get a little bit tight end in here, get a little bit freaky. Yeah. So obviously Cooper Kupp must start, but Demario Douglas against the Chiefs is very interesting. The Chiefs are weirdly the third best slot matchup. But we've talked about this the last couple of weeks. They're not great against slot receivers. It's the outside receivers traveling to the slot who have a lot of success against the Chiefs. And we've seen that for weeks in a row where we've talked about the actual slot receiver struggling, but the outside receivers having a pretty good week whenever they spend time in the slot. Having said that, Demario Douglas becomes very interesting simply because he is the wide receiver 1 in New England whenever he's healthy. Bobby, are you starting Demario Douglas? How does he compare to the other out wide guys that we talked about already?
Yeah, he's a PPR only guy, in my opinion, because of his role. But like, this is what I wanted to bring up with Demario Douglas is that if you look at the guys who are primary 50-50 or primary slot guys, like Christian Kirk, Amon-Ra St. Brown, who faced the Kansas City Chiefs, they both had big time games because they were, I mean, Christian Kirk was kind of the 1B at the time, but Amon-Ra St. Brown's the one. Demario Douglas will get you probably 10 targets in this game. So I do feel like he is going to be a PPR asset. Mahomes offers a baseline for production. You know, he's going to be in the 20s with the Chiefs offense, which means that they're going to have to score points. It can't be a 10-7 game like it was against the Giants. So I do like that because of where they're allowing their fantasy points. Now, the one thing that does worry me is that the Chiefs are very good at yards after the catch. They're 30th in yards after the catch allowed per game. So that's where you get it done with Demario Douglas. 90th in ADOT, 4th in yards after the catch per reception. So that's why I don't feel like he's going to have a monster day. I could see him getting you 5 catches, in the 50 yards, get you that, PPR floor that you need as a wide receiver 3 this week. So that's why I think he's only PPR as a wide receiver 3, and everything else I'm kind of fading him.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. Since his injury, 4 of the last 5 games, double-digit PPR points. He's averaging 7.6 targets a week in that span. So he is someone that you can start in PPR, but in half PPR he's pretty scary. He's basically the opposite of Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis is someone who's very boom bust. Demario Douglas is going to be the option. He's got a lovely floor, but realistically, you don't want to be starting him if you need big numbers. He's someone that's unlikely to boom. It's not saying it's impossible. We saw Juju Smith-Schuster have a good game last week, but realistically, it's unlikely to happen in this offense, in this matchup. Now, let's move on to the tight ends. Let's talk about Isaiah Likely. Now, he's taking on the Jaguars. The Jaguars are the fourth best slot matchup. That's against wide receivers, but they're also the 10th best matchup for tight ends. So in general, they're really good at funneling targets into the middle of the field, and that's really likely to help Isaiah Likely, especially because realistically, the Ravens have struggled to get a consistent slot wide receiver going. They've used Nelson Aguilar there. They've had their other guys traveling to the slot, but they've used their tight ends a lot there because usually they have Mark Andrews and they're used to filtering targets to Mark Andrews. Last couple of weeks, the Jaguars against notable tight ends, David Njoku, 6 for 91 with 2 touchdowns. Tanner Hudson managed to go 4 for 35. George Kittle, 3 for 115 yards as a touchdown. Connor Hayward got 5 receptions against them. Guys like the Titans and Texans struggled, but they just went outside anyway. They didn't really need to use their tight ends. So realistically, it is possible it's going to be an Isaiah Likely game. Bobby, are you starting him this week?
I think that's the tough part for me is because when you're looking at a defense like the Jags actually play a lot of zone, which is why I want to bring this up because when a tight end goes to the slot, you're playing a lot of man. They typically line you up against a linebacker anyway. So maybe the slot matchup doesn't matter as much for our metric. But when you're facing a heavy zone team, when you just go to that zone, you're probably going to be covered by whoever, whatever slot cornerback is playing in that zone at that time. So that's something I wanted to bring up here. The other problem is that Isaiah Likely, I think I want to say he's a must start. But my question really is for you, Ben, because there's guys like Evan Engram, who we're going to talk about in a second, Travis Kelce, Dallas Goedert, George Kittle, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride. Like, where would you put Isaiah Likely amongst the must-start tight ends? Because there's a lot of people who just scooped him up and have him as a tight end too. Would you start him over any of those studs this week?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing with Isaiah Likely, isn't it? We talked about this a lot yesterday when we had the tight end streamer show. We talked a lot about the idea of running routes, and you want your tight ends running routes because realistically, tight ends have two jobs. They run routes and catch balls, and they block, and you don't want a tight end that's in to block a lot. Well, last week, Isaiah Likely, 45 routes. That's a lot, and they only played 72 snaps. So we're talking about, 2/3 of the time he's running routes. That's fantastic numbers for any tight end. Even the elite tight ends would like that. The problem is that we can't rely on that happening every week. It is possible they'll want to run the ball a lot and they'll get him in to block a lot. It is possible that they'll cycle things around a little bit more. So we just don't know what's going to happen. We know that last week he was pretty good. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, he's combined for 9 receptions, 123 yards and a touchdown. But you can't necessarily rely on that. So I can't have him over the studs. I realistically would have him behind Kelce, Hockenson, Laporta, Evan Engram, Trey McBride, George Kittle, David Njoku, and I'd even have him behind Jake Ferguson as well. It gets really interesting when you start comparing him to guys like Ferguson, Dalton Kincaid, and then all of the Steelers, streamers. I feel like that becomes interesting. I'd have him in front of Kincaid, behind Ferguson, but he's close enough to those guys that you can go either way. And I'd have him ahead of all the other normal streamers. Do you agree with that, Bobby?
I actually would put him ahead of Kincaid. I actually probably would put him ahead of McBride. Last week we saw it. Like, we saw the role, what happened. He became, like, the first week it was kind of like he got plugged in. Mark Andrews got hurt. Then post-bye, boom, they take off. He has that elite role. The Jacksonville Jaguars matchup too is key, right? This is a slot funnel defense. This is what we like to see. They are going to be banged up, but they're listening to Tyson Campbell, who was one of their better outside guys too. But yeah, that role is so good that the matchup is elite and the role is elite, and he's proven last week that he can do it. So outside of maybe the studs, that's like, in my opinion, Hockenson, Laporta. I would say Laporta now has earned that. Kittle is like, so I can't say no Kittle. I think they're playing Arizona this week, right? So, I'm not going to sit Kittle. He's like killed Arizona in his career. But yeah, I'm curious to see what people bring to the Sunday live show, because I think Evan Engram is also a guy that I would put ahead of him too. But yeah, I just wanted to bring these guys up because I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, because Evan Engram, in my opinion, is now a must-start tight end too. And I think the matchup is elite too. And I think no one has to worry about Evan Engram anymore. I think after the Cleveland game, you set it and forget it. He just went off against the toughest matchup for tight ends. What's your thoughts about Evan Engram? Because Christian Kirk being out, he's become the slot guy.
Yeah, it is really interesting with Engram. He's a must-start guy. The Ravens, I mean, they're 13th against the slot. They're like a good slot matchup. And we mentioned that because realistically, the Ravens in general are a very difficult team to play against. They're very hard to beat across the field. They've got an excellent defense. They're 27th against tight ends in general. But realistically, that's probably still the best way to target them. And Evan Engram really has taken over ever since Christian Kirk got injured. Let's look at a couple of the notable matchups the last few weeks. Davis Allen last week went 4 for 50 with a touchdown. Gerald Everett scored a touchdown, went 4 for 43. Tanner Hudson, 4 for 49. David Njoku, 6 receptions. Admittedly, the Seahawks were awful. But before that, Trey McBride, 10 for 95 and a touchdown. That's a lot of touchdowns. That's a lot of receptions. Realistically, of late, this has been a matchup that you can start to target. And the last 2 weeks, Engram has gone 20 for 21 for 177 yards and 3 touchdowns. For me, he's a top 5 tight end. I feel like you have to start him as your tight end. The real question is, if you've got two good tight ends, if you've got someone like a Kelce or a Laporta or a Hockenson, and you've got an Evan Engram or an Isaiah Likely, do you start them in the slot? because realistically, these guys are both running 40-something routes. That's more than a lot of the receivers out there.
Right.
Comparing them to the guys in that wide receiver 40 range, the guys like Demario Douglas that we talked about, could you start one of these tight ends over one of those receivers?
Yeah, that's in my opinion. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because I'm like, it's just a unique topic to talk about, because we focus so much on the wide receiver slot versus wide, because that's where the data is coming from. But once a tight end becomes essentially the slot receiver, you have to bring them up. And I think Likely's interesting. And Jamie brings up a really good comment here about the wins in that Jags-Ravens game. These are both low ADOT guys. Like, these guys are expected to do their damage after the catch. I think they're both last week were like 6 yards. Those are the guys who won't be impacted, because if it's high winds and you can't throw deep, they're going to get the short routes. So that might just help their PPR floor even more in higher win matchups. Those vertical threats, guys like Calvin Ridley, for example, Odell Beckham, might be impacted more by high winds. But we'll definitely monitor that and have that for the Sunday Live show. But let's dive into some downgrades, Ben.
Yeah. And the other thing to remember at wins, by the way, remember the Ravens versus Rams game last week was meant to be the weather game. It was meant to be the game that we all avoided because it was heavy rain and a lot of wind. And it ended up being, 37-31 or something like that. Like, it was an insanely high-scoring game, and everyone in fantasy was good. So don't overthink wins. Definitely don't even think about rain. Rain has pretty much no impact on fantasy. You'd think it would, but other than adding a couple of drops, it really doesn't have a lot of impact. It's only when we start talking about snow and extremely high winds that we start getting worried about fantasy. So don't overthink that.
Well, now, I think just sorry to cut you off, but the one thing I'm going to say about that, though, is it's extremes. Like, when in the 15-mile-an-hour winds, they're going to report on that, but that's not going to have that much of an impact on a football game. Once you get to like 25, 30, that's when things start getting bad. Same thing with rain. Like, rain in general, not a problem. But if it's a downpour, it's going to be a problem, right? So, like, I guess we're not meteorologists. We're not there in person. It's tough for us to figure out I think that we have to do a better job on, like, how bad the rain is going to be. But I think if you start seeing snow, extreme wind, extreme rain, that's when we have to start. Okay, that's when you have to downgrade a player. But it's a good tiebreaker in some cases. But I think you're right. Some rain is not a problem. I have to do a better job learning how many inches per hour is impactful for fantasy football. I'll take that as a note. Let's move on, Ben.
Yeah, off-season project for you. Sounds like fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's talk about some downgrades. So we've got the Dolphins guys against the Jets. The Jets have been fantastic all season. We talked about Michael Pittman earlier. We're going to dive into that against the Steelers. Amari Cooper against the Bears, and Mike Evans against the Packers. Now, for me, realistically, half of these guys you're starting anyway. I'm starting Tyreek Hill regardless of what happens, assuming he's healthy. And he seems like there might be a little bit of an injury issue there, but assuming he's healthy, and I think he probably is, he's an absolute must start. I also think that we're learning that you have to start Mike Evans. Every time we don't start Mike Evans, he absolutely blows up. He's only had 1 week under 13 PPR points since week 7. Now, unfortunately, that was last week. But realistically, for me, Mike Evans is a must start. So let's dive into the other guys and talk about them. So Jaylen Waddle, I think, is the really interesting one. He's been someone that we're talking about who was a wide receiver 2 all season, but realistically, he hasn't been. He's the wide receiver 28 on the season. He's just not getting enough targets to be productive. The problem is, we said this against the Jets last time. Against the Jets last time, we said, well, this is the toughest out wide matchup. And it's a tough slot matchup as well. It doesn't matter what they do with Hill and Waddle. Waddle's going to really struggle. And then he goes for 114 yards on 8 receptions. It was ridiculous. So it should be a best matchup. And we were all pulling our hair out about this last week because half of us sat him, rightly so, and he absolutely blew up. Can we sit him again, Bobby?
So here's the thing with that. I broke this down earlier. What they did is they moved Jaylen Waddle to the slot. So in that game against the Jets, he had 4 catches for 70 yards in that game. He had 130 yards receiving from the slot all season long before that. So right there was like they purposely moved him into the inside. So it's like they clearly understand that they're not going to beat Sauce Gardner and Reed on the outside. So they moved him inside. It's a ton of sense. The problem is, can you count on that to happen again? Didn't run a lot of routes. He just got targets. So unfortunately, I can't sit him because Tyreek Hill, if he's limited at all, I know it's one thing to play that when you actually get hit, you have the adrenaline, the swelling doesn't happen right away. So you're able to get back in the game, but he hasn't practiced all week. So if Hill's limited and only playing 66% of the snaps, we've seen in the past that they go right to Waddle right away. So I'm not going to sit Waddle because of the Hill injury, and I'm not sitting Hill. It is what it is, folks. I'm sorry. Fantasy football is a terrible thing. I don't know why we do it, because now you're forced to start Hill and he might not even play half the game. He might be a decoy, whatever. Michael Pittman, on the other hand, looking at the Steelers game, I think in PPR formats, he's going to be fine. He just gets too many targets. And so I'm not going to be sitting him because he's performed well in similar matchups. Panthers and Saints are both pretty good on the perimeter. He also found the end zone against the Cleveland Browns that are like the toughest out wide matchup during that time frame. So for me, Pittman is still in PPR. I think when you get to half and standard, you might be okay to get away from him because it's going to be a tough day for him. Amari Cooper is probably the one guy I'm going to sit. The Flacco thing is probably good. He's playing against a Bears team, by the way, who's completely turned it around on defense. They are good across the board. So they have eliminated they're 18th in air yards allowed, 12th in yards after the catch. And when you look at Amari Cooper, he beats you in air yards. He's 26th in air yards, ADOT per attempt, ADOT, and then 69th in yards after the catch. So I think out of this list, Amari Cooper's the only guy I'm going to consider sitting. Obviously, if you come with like, hey, what about Joe Schmo from this guy? And I'm like, no, okay, you still play Amari Cooper. But yeah, I think he's the only guy that seems to make sense to me as a sit. And Mike Evans, you brought it up perfectly. I will say this. If Jair Alexander does play, I think he becomes a wide receiver 3. I think you're never going to sit Mike Evans, but maybe you fade him in DFS and would you consider starting let's say you're debating between a Michael Pittman or your favorite upside receiver, insert Gabe Davis this week. Would you start Gabe Davis over Michael Pittman if you know Mike Evans is going to face Jair Alexander this week? What's your thoughts about that?
I think we got to be really careful with these matchups, and these two matchups in particular stand out to me. Even though the Steelers and the Bears are among the top 5 toughest out wide matchups by the metric, because we're only measuring off 6 weeks, there is a little bit of variability around which teams those teams have faced. So if you look at who the Steelers have faced in the last 6 weeks, they faced the Patriots, who just have no good wide receivers. They faced the Cardinals with Marquise Brown injured. They faced the Browns when the Browns were struggling before they had Flacco going. They faced Green Bay, who mostly did it through the slot. And they faced the Titans, who don't tend to pass their wide receivers a lot. So I feel like it looks like a tough wide receiver matchup. But realistically, if you look season long, the Steelers have actually conceded the 13th most points to wide receivers. So I feel like even though they've been good the last few weeks, it's hard to tell how much of that is the Steelers being a really good secondary and how much of that is them just playing against weak opponents. For that reason, I'm not overreacting to it. Pittman's got such a good floor that unless you've got some real upside players, you can play over him. And I mean real upside players like your Mike Evans, like Puka Nacua, like, Brandon Ayuk, guys like that. I feel like you have to start Pittman. Pittman's my wide receiver 12. And to an extent, Amari Cooper's in the same argument where the Bears, even though they're a tough wide receiver matchup, if you look at them season long, they've only conceded the 17th most points. So they're kind of like a mid-range secondary. So while I don't want to start Cooper, for me, he's still a wide receiver too, and I'm still willing to start him over all of the other guys that we talked about earlier when we talked about the Gabe Davises, the Demario Douglas, guys like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I think Amari Cooper's the only guy I was trying to sit anyway. The Bears defense, they just like, there's something going on. The other thing is it's going to be that Cleveland game, the Chicago Bears, the wind, all these things are going to be impacting that game too. Something tells me Amari Cooper's probably not going to be a top 24 wide receiver this week. So I'll call it a fade. All right, let's get into your streamers and stashes, Ben, and get out of here.
Let's do it. So, obviously, already talked about Matthew Stafford. I feel like that's an obvious one. You can obviously also go to Sam Howell as an alternative. For running backs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is someone who's really interesting because he actually is the main lead back there. He's not someone I want to start, but if you're desperate, you can go to him. Or you can also go to Donta Foreman, who's become the main guy in Chicago. Neither of those are great matchups. Neither of those guys I want to use. But realistically, at this point in the season, you probably know who you're starting. are, and you have to be pretty desperate to go elsewhere. You can also go towards Ty Chandler for the same reason. But my favorite wide receiver streamer, and probably my favorite streamer of the week, is Jackson Smith-Njigba, topping the Seahawks in targets the last 2 weeks. I think he's someone you should consider. And if you want to get a little bit freaky with tight ends, and we talked about a lot of good tight ends, but not everyone has one. I think Taysom Hill's an interesting option this week. We know that they use Taysom Hill a lot when they're leading. They're playing against the Giants. And if you're not the Packers on Monday Night Football, you're probably beating the Giants. So there's someone that I think you can rely on as well. Taysom Hill, very useful, assuming he's healthy.
I didn't care for that comment. Obviously, you could tell that I am excited about Tommy DeVito. And listen, we're coming, baby. We're coming for that last spot, folks. 9-8. We're going to be there. I'm super stoked. Tommy DeVito, MVP for the rest of the season. All right, that's all we got today, folks. Once again, it's the Razzball Fantasy Football Podcast on the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to the Razzball Fantasy YouTube channel. We're doing great stuff, and join us every Sunday. We do 2 hours of start-sit questions for all your needs heading into Week 15. So join us this Sunday. We'll be on live for 2 hours. Also, make sure you go to IG and TikTok, and of course, make sure you jump over to razzball.com and check out all the great articles we got from great writers, including myself, Ben, and everybody on the staff. So go to football.razzball.com. Thank you for joining us once again. We are out of here, folks.